Going along with chapter 12 is chapter 13. And in chapter 12, we talked about instructions and how to write them and consider the audience. And in chapter 13, we learn how to test. And testing instructions is an essential part of the technical writing process because you cannot simply write directions and then publish them, include them with whatever product the user needs to use without testing. And the reason for this is because you never know how things are going to work. You might think you're writing your instructions in a manner where it's very easy for the reader to follow them and do what you need them to do in order to complete the process. But until you truly test it with a variety of people, you're not going to know how it goes. Chapter 13 really gets into testing and what it means. So we're going to talk about usability. And the reason why we start with talking about usability is we need to understand what it actually means. And then we'll get into the concepts of testing it, testing your instructions, reviewing what happened, and then reporting it. This way you get a very good idea of exactly what technical writers do when they need to test. There are 5 factors of usability, and these really help us to better understand what usability actually is. Usability has to do with these 5 things. The first one is the ease of learning. So how easily can you teach someone the process, or did you teach someone the process in terms of instructions? This determines how usable the process is. Then there's the efficiency of use. How quickly, safely, quickly can it be done? This isn't for the people who are those who will ignore your instructions and just go on with the process without them. It's more to the extent of how easily can they use these instructions in a timely manner, in a reasonable amount of time. Then there's memorability. How easily are the steps remembered if necessary? This gets into a different aspect of usability testing. It's not going to be for processes where you're doing the thing one time, such as with the bookcase I have right here, which I recently built with my husband from an IKEA package. I don't need to memorize the steps. It's built. I have no intention of taking it apart. So it's not an important part here. But if you're going to try to teach someone a process for how to do something and they have to do the process over, then that memorability is an important part. Then there's error issues, and these errors are called frequency, severity, and recovery. How often do they happen? How bad are they? And how easily can they be overcome? You cannot determine this without testing. And your usability testing you'll do for this class will really give you an idea of what sort of odd errors can pop up. If you watch the video links on Canvas, you'll see a few of the odd ways that usability testing can go, what I call sideways. And then there's subjective satisfaction, clearly hard for me to say today. This is just how easy did the audience find your steps and how happy are they with them? Because you can get them through the process, but you can irritate them to no end in the process. And so you want to make sure your instructions are not only easy to use and then quick enough for the reader, but then also that they're happy with the process. When it's time to usability test, there's a few key elements. The first one is the reviewing process. And this is basically where you're doing what we do, which is the revise, edit, proofread process. You're going through the document, you're making any necessary changes, you're ensuring the information makes sense in the way you've presented it, both in the words themselves, but in the visual look of the document. Then you're going to evaluate. This is when you bring someone else or a multiple someone else's into the picture to look at the document in terms of strengths and weaknesses. You might run it by the product designer or the marketing team or the product launch team, whoever it might be, just to get their input. These are not usability testers by any means because they're still internal to the process, but they do need to evaluate the document and better understand, is it going to work or not? Then we have testing, and this is when you're going to do a formal test. You're going to observe the test and you're going to analyze what happened, and you're going to use people who are not familiar with the process. There are companies who do this. One of your videos is from Blink UX. It's basically Blink usability testing, and that's what they do. That's all they do is usability testing. And so the video that I have linked is basically kind of like their promotional video where they tell you how to do usability testing and what they do, and they usability test fruit. It's cute, it's amusing, but it gets you the idea. This is the idea of usability testing in a nutshell. And What I've tried to convey to you so far with your papers in this class is your writing process is not one way. It doesn't fall on a line, because you need to write it, like draft it, revise it, redraft it, edit it, redraft it, proofread it, redraft it, and then maybe go back to the revised part. It doesn't happen in a single pass. And unfortunately for a lot of students, you think that it can, but really good writing of any sort does not. And this graphic shows you exactly how many directions this usability testing process can go. Now you got to decide whether or not to test in the first place. And let me tell you, usability testing is expensive. It makes your timeline longer. It means you have to bring in people to do the testing or hire a company to facilitate it for you. It can lengthen the timeline and cause you a lot of money. So you have to decide whether or not you're going to test. The time and money are the two big ones here. Do you have the time to test, and do you have the money to test? But the first one is the one that tells you whether or not you're going to do either of those things if you're going to spend the money and the time. How important is the document? How important is the contents of that document you want to test? If it's really important, then you're going to spend the time and money. No way around it. Now, so editing, the first thing you're going to do before you edit is you're going to look at it in terms of design, and you're going to say, okay, is this design effective? Does it do what we need to do? Does it meet my readers' expectations? Does it teach them what they want to know? Does it teach them in a way they expect to be taught? Do I approach this topic honestly? Do I make sure they're warned when things could be at a breaking point? Like, you have to be very careful tightening this screw, because if you over tighten, you might damage this. You have to be very honest about it. And then you want to make sure that you're coming across, you as the writer are coming across as reliable and honest and helpful, because the reader wants to be able to trust you. This means you need to honestly guide them through the process, caution them when you need to, give signal phrases and feedback loops, and make sure they understand exactly where they're supposed to be in the process. Now, when you're organizing, this is an important part of it. The first part of it is to make sure you haven't left anything out from taking an outline to a draft. And let me tell you, I'm not an outliner. I'm a jump in and writer. And so this one doesn't really apply to me, but what I do is I make notes. And my favorite thing in the world are these yellow, can you see it? Kind of. So those big yellow pads, kind of see it. Okay. Back in the day, I would have just page of notes when I'm writing a document. This one is actually planning a couple months out for a magazine that I design. That's how I do my outlining. It's on paper. I make my notes there. I'll scribble over things. I'll draw arrows to redirect them. And it's usually a big old mess. It's actually kind of funny. But I have to make sure as I go through, if I do something, I cross it out. So if I include it in my draft, I cross it out. Then the next thing we have to make sure is the organization is logical. Not just for us, but for the item itself. Is the information within the document presented in a logical format? Is it organized in a way that our reader will understand? Remember, none of this is about you, right? It's about the audience. It's about the reader and what they understand. So it's important that you make sure the organization is logical for them. Then any emphasis has to be appropriate. You can emphasize through signal phrases areas where there's, to be caution or danger in the process. You can give them tips to just check in and make sure the process is going along the way, and then just giving things appropriate emphasis. The entire document is like not, super major serious. You need to have levels of it so the reader knows exactly where the emphasis is and why it's there and why it's important. And then the fourth one, this one's interesting. Are my arguments well developed? This doesn't really sound like something belonging in technical writing, right? This sounds more like composition, like an English composition class with a thesis and supporting arguments. But in this case, the idea here is your argument is you want the reader to do the process the way you've described. Have you developed the relationship with the reader through the presentation of information to get them to do it your way? If you haven't, you might want to go back. So with visual and written elements, we need to look at them in terms of consistency. So is everything presented consistently? So all the graphics are a certain size and placed in a certain place or in a rotation that's appropriate. All the figure tags are labeled. All the text has an appropriate and consistent hierarchy with bolds and underlines and italics. If you are referring to a thing in capital letters one time, do you refer to it in capital letters the entire time? These consistency elements can take a long time in your editing process to verify, a very long time. In the past, I had to put together a large document, a very large document, like a 300-page document which had multiple authors. And so I was kind of like the editor. And then there was these multiple authors. And let me tell you, they all did it differently. Every last one of them. So I don't even know how many passes at this document. The first time I would go through and I would make sure that this word was all capitalized the same. And then I would go through and I would make sure this word was capitalized the same, or this one was spelled the same when there could be a variation, which is possible. That makes the editing process laborious. But shoot, that document was typed by the time it was done. That doesn't mean I didn't find stuff after it was already printed and it was like, ugh, but it happens. Then you want to make sure your paragraphs are well developed and your sentences are clear and correct. So your paragraphs have, your thesis statement and supporting information. All of your sentences have subjects and verbs. You have absolutely correct prose at all times. This can be kind of challenging, particularly if you write the way you speak. You want to make sure you sort of rein that in your process when you're going through the revise, edit, proofread, and you're tightening it up. And then graphics are appropriate, right? Remember that graphics aren't there because they're pretty. Not in technical writing. Graphics are there because they have a purpose. So when you're proofreading, here's some guidelines. And let me tell you, these are like my 4 main steps to this process. So the first one is sit aside the time and the willpower. Find wherever you're most comfortable. Get everything that you need around you. If it needs to be like 2 different colored pens, Starbucks, Kleenex, whatever it is. Don't give yourself a reason or a need to get up from your desk. Give yourself the time to focus. For me, there's certain places where I'm more comfortable, but mostly it's usually at a desk when it comes to proofreading, although there have been times, because I'm a paper proofreader, that means I need to see it on paper. I'll print out a draft, and then I'll just like kind of cozy up on the couch with the dog and a pen and a lap desk and make it work. You don't want to have any distractions in this process because you don't want to stop in the middle of the process at any point. You're going to look at some key things. Problems with word endings. This has to do with consistency and clarity throughout the document. With that document I mentioned where I was an editor for multiple authors, some wrote in present tense, some wrote in past tense. They all wrote in passive voice, so it all had to be fixed. Missing and repeated words had to be fixed as well. Like if someone had a word they really liked and it just showed up all over the place, then it had to be worked out. And then there's number 4. And number 4 is important. And I talk about this in the revise, edit, proofread process for you. The key for me was 2 things. First, none of my documents I was ever editing were double line spaced like your typical college paper, right? These documents looked more like your memos, more like the reports that we've done. And so it can be very hard to proofread when those lines are that close together. For me, my eye jumps around, tends to wander. My brain tends to go to head. I'm really bad about that. And so I use 2 methods to make me read one line at a time. The first thing I do is I print that document in full double line space. It changes where everything is positioned and it gives your brain a fresh look at it. The second thing I do is I cover. So it's hard to see because I haven't done the camera, but here's my paper. So I will use, like if this is my printed document, I'll use one paper here and one paper here and only show one line at a time. And that forces my eye to focus on one particular area. That second method is long, it's laborious, but it's fabulous. It's fabulous. It's perfect. And so if you have a document you're really struggling with or it's super important, try it. Definitely try it. The other thing you can do is try the outline view. I don't work very well with the outline view, like in Microsoft Word. I prefer hard copy editing. That big, huge document, I wasted a lot of paper. I felt so bad. I recycled it all. I swear to you, it didn't go in the trash. I recycled it, but I'm a paper editor. I can't help it. I got to see it printed out. So let's talk about UX a little bit. So UX is usability testing, and there are 3 groups involved in UX. The first is the users. These are those potential customers. These are the people who you want to test your document to make sure the process works. And then you have SMEs, those are subject matter experts. This is you as the writer, it's the product developer, it's the designer, it's the marketing team. These folks are involved. And then there's usability experts, because there are folks who do this for a living and they know how to make it work. Blink UX, who I gave you a link to in Canvas, is an excellent example of it. There's 5 major forms here. So the first one is surveys and interviews. You've probably experienced this as college students. There's like people constantly roaming the campus, right? They're constantly roaming the campus and they want to give you a survey. Students are a favorite survey group because you're kind of a captive population, and it's usually a particular population a lot of companies are interested in, because you're just starting to have your own money to spend and kind of getting out into the world. The other place you'll see a lot of this has to do with like malls, county fairs, et cetera, where there's just a large gathering of people. Then there's user observations. This is kind of what usability testing is. You watch the users as they do something. And then there's interviews of SMEs and UX experts, talking to them about the process and how it works. Focus groups, you have a couple of funny examples. One from Snickers Peanut Butter Squared that's very funny, but it's pretty much a focus group. That's where you put a group of people together in a room and you tell them about something and you let them bounce off of each other and you just kind of listen, although there is usually a facilitator there to keep the conversation moving. And then there's commercial UX services, just like Blink UX, where you can hire them and you can have them help you out. Especially if you don't do this a lot, it doesn't make sense to have it on staff. Now, there's 3 principles of usability testing, and the basic one is that testing goes throughout product development. It's not just after you write the instructions, right? It's, when the product is being developed, it has to be tested to make sure it's used the way you need it to be used. When it's done, it's probably put in the hands of users to figure out how they would use it, and you watch them. And that's when usually the person writing the instructions is watching as well to see how people use it. It's kind of the idea of giving a kid a toy and seeing what they will do with it. And that happens a lot in toy testing, just to see how they would play and to get a better idea of what the toy can do. This really means you're going to test real users as they use a real product and see what happens. And then you're going to have some goals in mind, some things you want to accomplish along the way. There's 3 stages. Obviously, you have preparing, conducting, and interpreting. Preparing for the UX means you're basically gathering everything you need to gather. So you're finding the people who are going to do the testing. You're finding the people who are going to conduct the testing. You're preparing the materials that's necessary, getting the product together, arranging a facility, all that good stuff. Then you're going to actually conduct the test. And then you have to report what happened. And that is a usability testing report. There's 8 steps you need to prepare. The big thing here is basically trying to better understand the audience and then making the test work. Getting a location, finding the team, picking the people involved, all of this good stuff. Everything but the test takes a long time. The usability testing doesn't usually take a long time, like the test itself, although you will run it multiple times. Now, here's a big deal. You must ask for legitimate informed consent. This means the persons you're speaking to, whether it be in surveys or focus groups or in usability testing, have to be fully aware that not only are you watching and studying them, but you are documenting what they do. They have to know. One of the key things is they must know that they can stop the test at any time for any reason, and they do not need to explain it to you. They are in complete control of what happens. You need to talk about how you'll disguise them, how they can see what happens with the results, all sorts of good stuff. It basically puts those subjects of the test in control of the situation so that they're going to be much more honest with what's going on. I found this cartoon and I thought it was funny. And this happens a lot, especially if someone is less than forthcoming. I've noticed it on campus a few times. We'll get folks on campus who are there to survey students and they'll step up. They're like, hey, can you mind if I ask you a question? And then you say yes, and then they dive in and they don't really give any identifying information. Or there's those signature harvesters. Please stay away from the signature harvesters because you don't know what you're signing. There's no time to read it. Don't sign it. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, and you probably won't see this on the image here, but have you ever noticed, oh shoot, I'm gonna try to pull it down a little, how they'll do, you can't see it, but they'll do this, they'll fold the paper. You can kind of see it. You don't know what you're signing. Stay away from the signature harvesters. Okay? Stay away. My light's coming in my blinds. But you really need to make sure people, when you're using them as subject, they have to be fully aware of what's happening. You have two tasks with the testing. First, you're going to interact with the participant during the testing. This is normal. In the case of the usability testing you're going to do for class, you are not doing this, okay? And then you're going to debrief the participant after the test, let them know, thank them. You're not going to really sort of evaluate their success or failure because you want both. You want to know what's going on, but you want to let them know what next steps are, how they can learn more about what happened, how they can get more information or whatever. Then you have 3 steps for reporting and interpreting data. The data is the important part, right? The data is what you learned from the test, and you need to know what you learned so you can report it and make any changes are necessary. So you're going to tabulate what you learned, you're going to analyze it, and you're going to report on it. You're doing all 3 of these things with your usability testing memo because you're going to run a test on the instructions you write, and then you're going to write a memo and you're going to say, what happened? What worked? What didn't work? What would you do differently? What happened in the process? There's a number of types of different reports, but you're going to do one specific one called a think aloud user protocol. So while you might interact with the user in ordinary situations, in this situation, I don't want you to provide any sort of information whatsoever. I want you to hand off the instructions and whatever this other person needs to run your instructions and sit back and watch and then write about it. So that's it with evaluating and testing technical documents. It's actually not a heavy chapter by any means, but the keys here are to remember there's just like no straight to publication technical writing. It's always tested in some sort of a way, sometimes through just a simple revise, edit, proofread process. Shouldn't really call it simple because that can be a laborious process, but through a revise, edit, proofread process, or through usability testing of end users to see how they react to your documents. I'll see you next time.